We've got Grant, who's going to be our second presenter. So Grant is from the School of Education and the Languages, Literacies and Literature Department, and his presentation is titled Possibilities for Critical Literacy in Large Group Online Teaching in South African Higher Education. Grant, you've got 10 minutes and I'll give you a shout when you have about 2 minutes to the end.
Thanks, Tanisha. Okay, so Anna Ferreira calls critical literacy a chameleon literacy, which by its nature has to adapt to the society it works in. Critical literacy is responsive to context, and its work is to point to new hierarchies of power, new systems that oppress, and new forms of language use, representation, and ways of learning and meaning making. Our discourses have changed in the past months, and new words are part of our everyday lexicon, as the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus has altered the way we teach and learn in South Africa. Words such as disruption, unprecedented, lockdown, level 1, asynchronous, adapt, and challenging times are regularly used in discourses around online learning. And there are also those dreaded words that became a meme in South Africa after they were uttered by our president, with immediate effect. However, with this new language comes new important considerations of access and diversity in learning environments. And we should be as vigilant as ever of how these discourses are not only reflecting, but might also entrench and normalize unacceptable power imbalances in South Africa. We know that the poorest students are the ones most affected by the shift to emergency remote teaching, and that the literacy practices involved in online learning are disadvantaging them further and exacerbating the impact of the virus on our country. While some of the richest discussions and learning moments in my face-to-face classes were only possible due to the economic diversity of students and the perspectives they could bring, and these types of vital discussions have all but disappeared as students from rural and poor communities are unable to log in, join synchronous chats, or read and engage with the learning material in their home environments. Despite the absolutely incredible work that was still done this year by all of you, my colleagues, and by the students who were able to adapt to online learning, the harsh truth is that we are missing out. Our students are missing out. And we have not only had to make compromises, but we have faced severe losses in the learning environments that we all love. I was afraid for a few months ago that if we reopened campus this year, that we would face massive protest action from students. And the reason I was afraid is that I knew students were completely justified in being angry at losing out on so many aspects of what makes an in-person university education meaningful and significant. I felt this loss myself in how I taught my first year course in the second teaching block. My first year course in media studies was my favorite course to teach because you still had the opportunity with these new students to blow their minds. I could witness many students newly discovering their curiosity for texts, language, images, and how these all work to reinforce ideologies in society. I could see excitement and enthusiasm for social justice issues developing in real time. Some students would, for the first time in a meaningful way, start to think about ideas of design and power. The best experience for me was when I didn't get to all of my lecture slides or discussion points because students had become so engaged that we went in a completely unexpected direction. I worked hard every year to make the course relevant, informative, and personal to students. And the conversations from class were the most rewarding part of the process for all of us. It truly felt like we were knowledge collaborators. I didn't want to lose this in the online space, but I knew early on that there would be loss. I tried to mitigate this through instilling strict schedules that forced students to engage. I made them do an online quiz each week, and one of the questions asked them to confirm that they had participated in the weekly forum task, making this count for a small amount of marks to ensure they participated. I structured the online lessons and scaffolded it all with clear definitions of important concepts and exact strategies on how to read and interpret texts. Of course, these kinds of definitions and strategies would not so neatly be contained and tied up in a bow if we were working together in class, as critical literacy is a flexible literacy that often defies neat definition or clear-cut steps to be taken. I worked hard to make the course have low data requirements, to be asynchronous despite the scheduled deadlines for tasks, and to be as clear as possible with how students should understand and apply the types of reading approaches we dealt with in the course. I wanted students to at least get out of the course some of those critical literacy outcomes that I had set. The main outcome being to recognize that texts are constructed through choices that reflect ideologies and power relations in contexts. I used 3 central strategies to develop critical literacy in this course. My first strategy was an attempt to emulate classroom conversations as closely as possible while trying to avoid using synchronous meeting tools like Zoom or Teams. My consideration was always to try and give every student as much access as possible to the learning environment, and not to privilege those students who had Wi-Fi connections. Especially at first year level with a very large group, I understood that many students would struggle to even download recorded lectures, let alone have synchronous class discussions. Instead, I used the forum function on Sakai. I required students to post in the forum and to respond to at least one other student's post each week. I broke the class up into groups of 30, and this allowed the students to have slightly more intimate conversations and not to get lost in the large amount of messages that would have been posted if it was only one large forum chat. What I found was that these forum discussions became the heart and soul of the course in the online space. Students began to help each other with understanding work. They gave lengthy, meaningful answers to the questions, and they even sparked tangential conversations on the topics or gave some great examples to fellow students. This was one way of trying to make sure students do not simply post into the void, and although I responded to all of the direct questions or misunderstandings in the forum, I did not need to read each of the many hundreds of posts each week as students were engaging with one another. An important reason why I think the forums were so successful was that my teaching assistant, Fatima Valiessa, and I would always ask students to engage with texts that related to contexts that they were familiar with and that spoke to power relations that were current. For example, Fatima set questions on a Trevor Noah video from The Daily Show, where he spoke about the COVID pandemic in a comedic way. This allowed students to engage with the idea of genre and the idea of media as public service. What does media do in a pandemic? Is The Daily Show news or comedy? And should we take it seriously? The forum task showed that just as important as what is represented is how it is represented. I also asked students to bring their own texts for discussion to these forum tasks, which allowed them to practically apply the concepts and to engage with texts that were meaningful to them, rather than only looking at texts that I provided. One task asked students to find news headlines that contained examples of lexicalization or naming. Students had to
you've got 2 minutes left.
Sure. Students had to simply post their headlines with no comments, and another student had to identify and explain the lexicalization or naming that they found. In another task, students were asked to find an image that was used for a news story and explain how it positions them in relation to that story. And another student had to consider how the meaning would change if a different image were used. These types of tasks ask students to engage with their worlds and the words that reflect power structures in those worlds. There is an element of authentic learning in practice, and the group engagement could make the responses more personal and thus more powerful. There was no single right answer in the forum tasks, and students were not being tested, but rather asked to think about text, context, and power in shaping representation. The final strategy of working towards critical literacy that I explained in my presentation is multiple choice questions with multiple correct answers in weekly quizzes that specifically tested the interpretation of texts. Essentially, I would give them a text and ask them to look at various statements that could link to how those texts might be interpreted. While in this case, there were a number of correct answers and students would have negative marking for incorrect answers, the questions force students to apply their minds closely to the various types of meanings that can be read in those texts. What I found most useful about these types of questions is that they could immerse students in the discourses of the field. Students would see the language that I used when setting the questions and how I phrased the interpretations that were given as options to them. and they would be able to use similar discourses in their exam essay questions. I use these questions not only to get students to really struggle with how texts reflect meanings in contexts, but also to see how a media studies scholar would use the terminology from the course to express those meanings. While this did not allow the freedom and flexibility of having them each write an essay each week, I could ensure that students were becoming more familiar with how to read text in media stories and how to speak about texts in ways that allow them access to the academic discourses that they would have to be familiar with. So in conclusion, while I am not sure that these strategies achieved even close to the same level of academic development that previous iterations of the course could lead to, I was very pleased with the exam answers that I received and the way that students engaged on forums. However, I asked for feedback on the course in the final week, and students expressed their challenges in the ways that I had not given them a chance to express during the running of the course. This feedback was frankly depressing. While many students enjoyed the course, they spoke of the lack of access that plagues our country and the daily struggles that we do not speak about often enough that were exacerbated by lockdown. I thus found it hard to celebrate the successes of the course, and my lasting impression was of the structural disservice being done to these students. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Grant.